Hey everyone, I'm Chris. I serve as the lead pastor of Mill Creek Foursquare, and welcome to our podcast. This exists as an extension of the teaching ministry of our pastoral team. Here you're going to be able to find everything from Sunday messages to midweek communications, classes, interviews, conversations with friends. So we hope that you feel invited to participate in the life of our fellowship and receive of this ministry. Here you're going to be able to learn more about current events and much about the scriptures. So enjoy, relax, breathe, and ultimately may you be experiencing the presence of God. Our goal is to make disciples of Jesus who are experiencing his life, engaging in his presence, extending the gospel to their family, neighborhood, workplace, and world. So welcome and enjoy.
Welcome to episode number 10 in our midweek podcast. I'm John. I'm here with Pastor Trevor, and here is the third installment of a kind of mini series we've embarked on.
The trilogy.
A trilogy of episodes focused on the idea of the rapture. If you've been following along with us, you've probably noticed that we have spent now in a larger series focused on conversations around the book of Revelation. We've now spent 2 episodes where we didn't really say much about the book of Revelation. And part of the reason for that is that the concept of the rapture is often associated in fairly sort of general terms and with various kinds of assumptions and sometimes also more sort of worked out theological frameworks. It's often associated with the book of Revelation, but there's actually very little sort of, the word itself doesn't actually appear in the book of Revelation, and there are other texts within the New Testament that actually are most often appealed to in sort of defense of this idea of a rapture. And so what we've tried to do so far is spend a little bit of time sort of exploring where this idea comes from, and we discovered that it's actually a fairly recent development within church history, and it's a somewhat sort of idiosyncratic or kind of unique belief that develops in certain circles, as opposed to sort of a feature that any Bible-believing Christian ought to hold to. And then once we spent some time talking about that and talking about why, how this idea has some appeal to it, but might actually run, the logic of this rapture idea might actually run counter to so much of the logic and the theology of the New Testament and the Christian faith. Once we had set things up in that way, we moved into a bit of a more specific discussion in our last episode where we looked at 2 texts from the wider New Testament that are most often appealed to in defense of the rapture idea, and we tried to sort of deconstruct the concept itself by showing that actually when read well with attention to their context and with careful attention to the language and imagery being used in 1 Thessalonians 4 and Matthew 24, as well as its parallels, they actually don't support the idea of a rapture at all. In fact, they speak to this theology of the New Testament that runs sort of the other way around, or runs counter to the very idea of believers sort of escaping into some kind of disembodied heavenly existence, and instead speak about God's movement toward his creation for the purpose of both redemption and restoration. And so this is a fairly long intro, but the purpose of this episode now is to take what we've done in these previous 2 and to kind of ground our discussion back in the book of Revelation.
We're back.
And we'll try to do so in sort of 2 movements. One is to sort of look at some of the texts in Revelation that people sometimes think, oh, maybe this is another place that supports this rapture idea. And we'll try to look critically at those. But then we'll also try to emphasize again, as we've done throughout the sermon series and as we've done throughout our podcast conversations, that really the central theological message of the book of Revelation has to do with God's kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven. It has to do with God's movement toward his creation as opposed to any kind of escape for believers. So maybe to start us off, Trevor, would you want to walk us through some of the portions of the book of Revelation that people might appeal to as evidence of some kind of rapture being part of the scenario.
Yeah, I mean, there's numerous places we could point of just maybe ways that people have come to the book of Revelation to try to read the rapture into, with our own kind of presumptions, into the text. Because we've already observed the word rapture is never used in the book of Revelation. So that should already draw a question mark in people's minds around the idea of the rapture and how it fits into eschatology in a book that we would consider to be about the end. Now, one place I want to start in the middle of the book, actually. The reason I want to start here is because it's going to relate to our text last week that we looked at, 1 Thessalonians 4, Matthew 24. It's going to tie some of that together, and then we'll deal with some of the smaller issues within the book as well. So in the middle of the book, the middle chunk, we talked about this. I'd preached on this a number of weeks ago. I think it was 2 months ago, around chapters Revelation 6 through 16, which is the 3 sets of 7 acts of cosmic chaos, as I explained it. And it was this picture of, you just read through it, and there's the 7 trumpets, or the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls. And if you read through this section, you just see one thing happen, one trumpet's blown, then an event happens. Another trumpet's blown, another event happens, and so and so. And you see 21 events basically in a row. There's some interludes in there as well. But essentially, that's how the text is framed. And I talked about, and we've talked about before, how the picture of the 3 sets of 7 is that they actually are not a linear chronological kind of map or chart for us to figure out, but it's actually the same story being told from 3 different perspectives almost, that there's actually this crossover between them, that the book is not meant to be read, the book of Revelation is not meant to be read like one big sequential build up to a climactic end in human history, but rather the end breaks in over and over throughout the book.
Yeah.
And so in many ways, and you'll notice a couple things in the text. I don't want to get into kind of the depths of why this is. In some ways, it's mainly because there's crossover. They all draw from similar imagery. There's crossover. The 7 bowls and the 7 trumpets. I believe I'm getting that right? The 7 bowls. I always get the 3 mixed up. They're almost identical. I mean, they're almost identical in how the events that take place. Also, each one comes out of another. In many ways, they're like nesting dolls, that they're similar in kind, and they come out of each other. And so it's kind of questions that literal sequential reading of the section of the text. Now, when we come to the middle section of the middle of the 7 trumpets, and we're finally on the 7th trumpet taking place, we see this in Revelation chapter 11. The people of God are told in chapter 11, verse 12, then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies watched them. Now, sometimes when people read this in Revelation 11, it's made for an argument about a kind of a mid-trib rapture or something. Like in the middle of the chaos, the people of God are raptured up, into heaven, whatever else. Yet, as we keep reading, we should notice that we're approaching the 7th trumpet. And so as we've talked about the 3 sets of 7, each sets of 7, they end with a picture on the 7th. They end with a picture of the end, a picture that's going to come to fruition in Revelation 21, 22, at the very end of the book. So it's a picture of the end breaking in again and again. So the assumption should be, as we're reading this, that if that's true, then as we approach the 7th trumpet, we should see something taking place that is a reality of the end of days of sorts. And so we see this in chapter 11, verse 15. We're told this, "Then the 7th angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, 'The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever.'" And so what is this a picture of? The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord forever and ever. It's a picture of the kingdom of heaven, the trajectory of heaven coming to earth. It's a picture of the King Jesus of the cosmos coming and his kingdom in breaking to earth. It's a picture of what takes place in the very end. And so, which is how we should assume as we're reading it. But there's something key to notice in the picture here. Notice it's what brings and inaugurates this kind of second coming of Jesus and the kingdom of heaven to earth is the trumpet being blown. And the trumpet should be a picture that we remember in our past text. It's used in almost every major text when we speak of the second coming of Jesus, second coming of Christ, a trumpet is blown. We see this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16, when we are told, this text we examined last week, and you did a great job walking us through, is that for the Lord himself will ascend from heaven in a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first, and the people will be caught up in the air. So what's the picture? We talked about last week, this is a picture of the second coming of Jesus. And so it's a picture of the trumpet being blown. We see the trumpet being blown in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 52, that sometimes people make out to be a text about the rapture in some sort. We're told this by Paul. He says, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. Right? Paul is speaking of the kingdom of heaven coming at this moment when the final trumpet sounds, and will be forever changed in eternity with our Lord. Or Matthew 24, verses 29 and 31, a text again that we looked at last week. We were told immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will give, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of heaven will be shaken, and the Son of Humanity, in verse 30, will come down, ascending on the clouds. And in verse 31, and he will sound his angels with a loud trumpet call. And so once again, we see the trumpet being spoken of here. And the trumpet is not the picture in Revelation of a mid-trib rapture of some sorts or something, but it's a picture of the end of days. It's a picture of the second coming of Jesus. It's a picture that draws from Exodus, when the trumpet and the invitation on Mount Sinai for the people of God to come and meet the Lord, right? The Lord is descending. The picture isn't them being snatched up, but God's presence descending, his infinite presence, and one of invitation for people to meet God. And so we see Revelation, it's building thoroughly off everything we've seen in the New Testament already of the trumpet being blown and the new heavens coming to earth. So that's one examination. That's one text that people speak of. But there's also these little texts or these little things to address in Revelation. It's interesting because I've yet to find someone who made a large kind of swathing, here's the big picture of how the rapture fits into Revelation. It's always these little texts that people are kind of trying to pull.
Sure.
Because people are trying to fit the rapture into where does it fit in Revelation, since it's never explicitly mentioned. So one place is in Revelation chapter 4. In Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, that opening picture of the throne room scene. So this takes place in Revelation chapter 1. We had the opening picture of the Son of Humanity, and this picture of Jesus as this kind of apocalyptic figure. We saw in chapters 2 and 3 the letters of the 7 churches. And then chapters 4 and 5 are given these two portraits of the Lion and the Lamb, the portraits of Jesus. And we're told this, John told this, after I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven, and the first voice which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this. And at once I was in the Spirit, and behold, the throne stood in heaven, and he has given this vision. See, commonly at times, because people cannot figure out where the rapture actually would take place in Revelation, some say this is actually the rapture in Revelation. That the church, even though the word church is yours, is somehow called up to heaven, and now everything else can take place. What are your thoughts around this? Now, what do you think around that?
Yeah, I think it's yet one more example of how influential an overarching hermeneutical framework can be for one's interpretation of specific details, right? As we've been talking about, throughout the last few episodes. No one sort of comes to read the Bible as kind of a blank slate and just says, oh, well, this is what the words say, and so this must be my conclusion. We sometimes might think that we're operating that way, but no one reads or interprets anything that way. We always have some existing framework that we bring with us. And part of what it means to learn how to read the Bible responsibly and critically and carefully and wisely involves not just like lamenting that we have predetermined, assumptions or frameworks, not just trying to sort of avoid them at all costs and be completely objective somehow, but learning how to recognize and critically evaluate some of the assumptions and frameworks that we might bring to the text. And this is a great example where if I have already decided for whatever reason it might be that this rapture idea must be a thing, then it will be fairly natural for me to see language like come up here peppered throughout a text like this and go, oh, that must be the rapture idea. That must be another sort of reference to that kind of thing. Whereas if we follow the trajectory we have tried to throughout our sermon series on Revelation, throughout our podcast conversations, and we try to take seriously what is the book of Revelation communicating on its own terms, in its own frame of reference, with an understanding of its context, with an understanding of its genre, then that should help sort of counteract some of these assumptions. So, for example, if we go all the way back to our early discussions of the genre of the text, if the author has had some kind of apocalyptic vision, and then the purpose of this letter is to convey the details of this apocalyptic vision that he has had, so that the whole text can be understood as a prophetic text, as an apocalyptic text, and as a sort of pastoral letter, then we should see the angelic command to come up here, not as a kind of some reference to a specific moment within our sequential chronology of end times or something like that, but rather as a feature of this vision report. And if we actually compare this text to a number of other apocalyptic texts, we see that this is a fairly consistent theme. Apocalyptic texts very often have not only someone having these incredible visions of sort of transcendent realities, but there's very often an angelic being that functions as a mediator and an interpreter who might sort of explain certain things or guide the person who's having the vision. If you think about the book of Ezekiel, you see similar kinds of things happening there, where an angel will sort of, or the Spirit of God will sort of snatch Ezekiel and sort of take him off to different kinds of places. It's a similar kind of thing, and this is a common feature of apocalyptic literature. And so we certainly shouldn't assume that this must be a kind of reference to this rapture idea, when it's actually a common literary convention within this particular literary genre that is meant to sort of invite us into the next stage in the apocalyptic or revelatory encounter that we're reading about.
Yeah, so it's an invitation of this is a basic kind of 101 function of apocalyptic literature, of this heavenly perspective on our earthly realities, the curtain being open, kind of figuring out what's taking place. I was also thinking about too is that this invitation to come up here takes place multiple times throughout the book as well, and so it would seem strange if this was some sort of rapture to say that multiple times throughout the book are there multiple raptures. I've actually never heard someone who kind of has that theologicalism make an argument that every time it's used there is a rapture or some sorts, or what would be the usage even of that.
Yeah, it's much better to understand it just like there's a repeated phrase, "and I saw." Yeah, throughout the book, it would be much better to understand the "and I saw" motif and the "come up here" motif as sort of structural markers. The original text wouldn't have the same chapter and verse divisions that we have in our modern English Bibles. And so you could think of it as the way that the author has structured what he has written, as opposed to some very specific reference to a rapture kind of experience.
Yeah, so Revelation 4:1 is another one. If we take a chapter previously, step it back in the letters to the seven churches, Revelation chapter 3, verse 10 is another verse that people kind of use to extrapolate some sort of broader theological point about the book. And so Revelation chapter to the church of Philadelphia, we're told this in chapter 3 of Revelation, verse 10. Jesus says this to his church. He says, "Because you have kept my word about patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to try those who dwell on the earth." And so the assumption, again, and I think this really comes back to that picture, again, every text is bringing an assumption to the text about what John's point or Jesus' point here when he's speaking to the churches is. And so sometimes he'll make a point here that, they're going to keep them from the hour of trial. So that means they're going to be raptured up before the great tribulation happens. And that's what this is referring to or something, though it does not say that explicitly. And I think it's important to observe here a couple of things. One, the word hour. Like, what is the word hour? How has John actually used that throughout the book of Revelation? And the clear sense of the word hour throughout the book is a reference to the very end. It's a reference to the hour of final judgment. It's a reference to that picture in Revelation 20 we read about, the lake of fire, all these things that we've been talking about. I've talked about in this sermon a few weeks ago. We'll probably eventually do an episode about hell or something along those lines too. But the picture here is that God keeping his people in the very end, right? That final moment when God's kingdom comes to earth, when God, it brings evil out of his kingdom, not an underground torture chamber, right? But outside the city walls of the New Jerusalem. And so it's a picture here of God keeping people in the very end, right? It's not a picture, and this is where we can misconstrue this line, is that, Jesus is never going to have me go through any trial, tribulation, or test. Though it would seem to contrast, if we took that assumption, it would contrast against everything we've heard about tribulation. We talked about first episode on the rapture, when we spoke of Jesus' promise that we will experience tribulation. And so it's a picture of Jesus keeping his people in the very end, right? It's a picture of restoration, renewal. The only other argument that I've generally heard people make about Revelation is this use of the word church. Because sometimes people reference how in chapters 1 through 3 we see the word, specifically the word church used, and then chapter 3. But then after chapter 3, the church is never mentioned again in the sense of an explicit usage of church. And so sometimes people assume, well, that must mean, it's an argument from silence, but it must mean that the church has been raptured up or something along those lines. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Well, yeah, simply that the absence of a word doesn't necessarily indicate the absence of a concept. and a book like Revelation, as many other books in the New Testament, has multiple ways of portraying the covenant people of God.
Yeah.
And especially the book of Revelation specifically does so in a number of ways that are sort of fascinating and tie together images and themes from both the Old Testament and the New Testament, so that for example the two witnesses can be understood as sort of evoking sort of memories and traditions associated with significant Old Testament prophets, but also speaking of using those images and using this symbolism of these two witnesses as a way of talking about the sort of prophetic function of the new covenant people of God. Or all the way at the end of the book, the New Jerusalem, there's this striking imagery of a city coming down out of heaven, but it's also described as a bride. And certainly one could try to force it into a kind of literal interpretation, like I guess we're supposed to expect some kind of city in a bridal gown coming down out of heaven. But most interpreters would recognize the city and bride imagery works together to talk about the people of God as a whole. And so I would just suggest that even if the Greek term ecclesia, church, or the gathered community, is not used after the messages to the seven churches, that certainly doesn't mean that references to the new covenant people of God, what we would call the church, are absent from the rest of the book.
Well, and it would seem to me that there are, as we're talking to, right, there's an argument of silence that people make at times. And also there just seems to be explicit references to the church throughout the book, right? I mean, you read about after the letters to the seven churches, 13 times are the God's people referred to as saints. A common term we know for the people of God, for the church. Even we talked about this when I preached in Revelation chapter 11, but when you spoke of the two witnesses just now in Revelation chapter 11, we were told of these two witnesses, and we're told this in verse 3 when Jesus says, "I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth." Verse 4 of chapter 11, "These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth." And so we're told of the two witnesses, which we know is in the Old Testament is the minimal number of people to bring acceptable testimony before a judge. And we're told the two witnesses are the two olive trees, which draws from the night vision of Zechariah chapter 4, and not doing things and rebuilding in our own strength, but in the Spirit of God and the power of the Spirit. And he explicitly says the two olive trees are the two lampstands. And we've already been given a hermeneutical key earlier in the book in Revelation chapter 1, verse 20, where we were told who the lampstands are. We were told the seven lampstands are the seven churches, and seven representing these seven historical communities of faith, but also seven representing the communities of faith, the church, throughout history from age to age. And so the picture here, we're explicitly told who the lampstands are and that they are the church. And so it seems to me to be as explicit as John's going to get within this apocalyptic genre to say in the middle of the book that this is the church, this is the testimony of the people of God. This is the church, the local church within the world. And we see that later on in the text that they are conquered, they're killed, they're conquered, as we've broken down as a central theme throughout the book, that they are conquerors. And so it seems to be that throughout the book, the word church or words and imagery around associated with the church is explicitly used throughout the book as well. And this is another way that we almost bring our own assumptions to the text and try to make a theological system work. Now, we also know that the very end of the book, that the way a story ends, the way the book ends of Revelation, and any story in general, the way something ends is extremely important for how we understand the whole thing, the trajectory of the entire thing. And so can you walk us through how does the very ending picture, Revelation chapters 21, 22 of the book of Revelation, but also the entire canon and testimony of Scripture, how does that relate to and help us understand and unpack this idea of the rapture, or maybe something very different?
Yeah. I mean, some scholars, I think a scholar named Barbara Rossing, but then she's been quoted by a number of other people, have sometimes talked about the book of Revelation communicating not only not having a rapture in it, but actually communicating something that we could call the rapture in reverse. Because as we've been talking about and reflecting on over and over in these conversations, the logic, the movement, the theology of the book really has nothing to do with the idea of escaping and getting out of here in order to avoid suffering or trial or tribulation, but rather the entire central theological message of the book has to do with God's kingdom, God's heavenly kingdom breaking into this present age and this world, and has to do with a very sort of practical call to followers of Jesus to be faithful witnesses, to engage in patient endurance in the midst of what they're going through, and to remain faithful to Jesus in that, as opposed to sort of hoping for or placing their bets on some kind of escape plan or something like that. And we've seen throughout our sermon series and throughout our podcast conversations the importance and significance of that theme of sort of faithful witness here and now, as opposed to just sort of hoping for some escape kind of thing at the end. We've seen it over and over already, but especially the very culmination of the book just sort of insists on this movement of heaven toward earth, as opposed to this idea of sort of people somehow escaping or something like that. The entire sort of final vision of the book, especially in Revelation chapter 21, is of a new heavens and a new earth. It's cosmic redemption and restoration and recreation, as opposed to, individuals escaping for the sake of sort of heavenly existence. And so, which itself is sort of consistent with a larger New Testament theology as well, right? One of the most unhelpful misunderstandings of the Christian faith, sometimes both within the church and outside of it, is that it's all about sort of individuals gaining some kind of heavenly reward where they live in sort of a disembodied heavenly existence or something like that. Whereas the entire emphasis of the Christian hope in the New Testament and in Orthodox Christian theology is on bodily resurrection, sort of embodied restoration, and heaven sort of breaking into the earthly space, the earthly sphere, this present age, that kind of thing. And so that reality of sort of heaven breaking into earth began in Jesus' earthly sort of public ministry, but will come to its sort of culmination at the end. And so we see this new heavens and new earth in Revelation 21, and repeatedly we see this description of the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And so what's crucial to recognize is the way that the book's sort of final imagery insists on this heaven toward earth movement, as opposed to anything like a kind of escape or removal kind of thing.
I think that's so important because, like any movie, any piece of literature, the end has bearing on the whole thing. Like a good movie or a good show or any good piece of literature, it's like that moment when you get the key to the end and the key unlocks how you view everything else. Yeah. It reframes or it affirms everything you've read all along. And I think that's really what the hope of the New Jerusalem and the heavens coming to earth. And I like how you're unpacking this dichotomy, because I think in one sense the dichotomy relates to the rapture, but I think it also relates to our view of our end of our lives, in the sense of this dichotomy of heaven or hell of sorts, right? Of when I die, okay, I'm going to heaven or hell, and that's the trajectory of the world, versus saying the trajectory of the world is God getting the hell out of earth and getting heaven to earth. And so it's a trajectory not of kind of like left to right, here's what I'm turning, but it's more this dichotomy of God doing something in the here and now. And I think that becomes a very important, and even when you read the scriptures, there's no verse in the New Testament that has a dichotomy of heaven and hell in the same verse. It's always heaven and earth, right? It's always the picture. That's the dichotomy, actually, is heaven coming to earth, heaven breaking into earth,
Yeah.
versus disembodied souls or disembodied spirits. Now, how does this apply to us right now? And here's what I mean: is this episode should be coming out, I believe, the day before Christmas, or coming out right around Christmas. I know it seems like a strange thing to apply the rapture, or rapture in reverse as we're talking about it, to the Christmas season. But what is the hope for us here that relates to the coming of Jesus and the birth of Jesus?
Well, I think I think one of the best ways to think about it is that our Christology is always related to our discipleship, and maybe that our eschatology is always related to our sort of ethics and practical lives. And I'm using big sort of technical terms from Christian theology, but Christology is just our doctrine of Jesus, who we think Jesus is and what he accomplished in and who he continues to be for us. Our Christology will inevitably shape our discipleship. So if I think that Jesus sort of, appeared to be kind of human, but really was mostly God. You know what I mean? Like he kind of put on human,
cosmic superhero.
Yeah, he put on like a human flesh skin suit for a little while and sort of
like
played the part. Yeah, exactly. Like if I think that Jesus was basically God-like, but then just sort of pretended to be, or sort of was kind of human for a little bit, but really the whole point was to kind of float a few feet off the ground the whole time and sort of speak a spiritual message to people that would one day become sort of disembodied souls in heaven or something like that. Inevitably, that will shape my discipleship. That will shape the sort of practical outworking of what I think it means to follow Jesus. If I think of Jesus primarily as a sort of spiritual figure or a divine figure whose primary sort of goal is to just be in heaven, in heavenly glory, then it will be fairly natural for me to sort of take a view of the Christian life that is oriented toward that as well. On the flip side, if my Christology is decisively shaped by a text like Philippians chapter 2, or even the gospel narratives of Jesus' incarnation, and even if my Christology is shaped by Orthodox Christian theology, which has insisted that that Jesus is both fully God and fully human, that he enters fully into the messiness of human existence. If that kind of Christology shapes my discipleship, then I'll take very seriously this idea that God's movement is always toward humanity. God's movement is always toward his creation. Because in this classic text from Philippians 2, what do we see? We see this, Paul is talking about how Jesus, theoretically, I suppose, could have just taken advantage of or exploited or taken for granted what it would mean to be God and just remained in heaven. But instead, his movement was a self-emptying one, a self-sacrificial one, a humbling of himself, a sort of downward movement where he gave himself for the sake of humanity. And so if I then turn around and think, well, really the point of my Christian life is to somehow just escape everything that might be difficult here and enjoy a kind of heavenly existence, then to some extent I'm abandoning or compromising the essence of what I'm sort of called to in following Jesus in that kind of way. What we're instead called to resemble and embody and follow in our discipleship is a God whose movement, whose posture, whose intention is consistently toward this earth in all of its messiness and difficulty and trial and distortion and all of these things, but it's toward this world for the purposes of redeeming and restoring and recreating it. Wow. And the essential call of Christian discipleship is to partner with God as he ushers in his kingdom, not to kind of sit around and wait to be sort of lifted out of here just before things get real tough. And so I think in the Advent season, we're reminded afresh, and as we celebrate Christmas, we're reminded afresh that Jesus' posture is always toward his creation, and that The fullness of the incarnation is what we're celebrating. And then that's the kind of framework that we're invited into as we participate as followers of Jesus.
Oh, that's a beautiful picture. And it seems to be just as we're closing up talking about the rapture, it seems to be the opposite picture, that rapture in reverse in many ways, because it's a picture that invites us not to how to get out of the world, but to participate with God into the renewal and restoration of this world. Not saying it's only dependent on us, but this picture of the words that it invokes, I'm hearing you speak, is, well, one, it's thoroughly consistent with our picture of Jesus all along. And also, just the words that come to mind are active participation, responsibility for this world. And so it seems to conjure up actually a more faithful obedience, that long obedience in the same direction, as Eugene Peterson calls it. It seems to me to call us actually to and fortifying us in a longer obedience than in a mere escapism of sorts, right? I think the invitation this Christmas season is to be called to that picture, and that to be reinvigorated, especially in the midst of COVID and stay at home, all the things going on in the world, to be reinvigorated by our picture of the incarnation that actually calls us to something that changes in the here and now, that actually invigorates us for the long haul, for the work of courageous witness.
Yeah, exactly. If the book of Revelation gives us a glimpse of what the end looks like, then that glimpse should shape what our faithfulness looks like in the present. And if that glimpse of the future is ultimately the will and intention and righteousness and justice and shalom of God invading and breaking into this world, to this present age, and recreating it in His image, if it's that sort of vision of restoration and new creation that is the sort of essence of our Christian hope, then that's the kind of thing we should be sort of participating in even here and now. And so the book of Revelation as a whole is inviting us not just to hope for some kind of escape, but to see what God is doing among us here and now in terms of the kingdom already beginning to arrive, and participate in that even while we await the full consummation of it at the end of all things.
Amen.
Thanks for listening to this episode. As usual, this episode has been edited by Tim Machira. It's been produced by Dave Sproul, and we've had music from Sherry Machira.
Thank you for joining us, and should you want more information or to engage with us further, please go to mc4s.org for more.